So here we are in Egypt, and probably one of the most popular civilizations for students to study in the ancient world. And as you well know, from a variety of perspectives. Again, we don't have time to do all of Egyptian history. Let's start a little bit with geography, though, and most would agree, I think, that it's the geography of Egypt that gets its start in this agricultural revolution, in this Neolithic revolution. Egypt is a country in antiquity some 750 miles long and only about 10 miles wide. So clearly, the Nile River is Egypt, and Egypt is the Nile. The Nile River has its origins in Lake Victoria and in also the Blue Nile in Ethiopia. And this great river is one of the only rivers in the world, in fact, the only river of its size for sure, that flows north. And it flows north into the Mediterranean and spills out through the Nile Delta into the sea there. So a very powerful river, a very predictable river that will allow people living up and down the Nile to farm in a very predictable manner. Egypt will be the civilization in the Mediterranean known for its abundance of grain, known for its regularity of this great resource. So, domestication of agriculture, domestication of animals happening in Egypt along this great Nile River at a very early time. We've talked about monumental building in Mesopotamia. We've talked about monumental building at Stonehenge. And perhaps the most famous example of monumental building in all of ancient history are the Great Pyramids. You have a selection in content, your content folder on the pyramids and how they were built. Pay attention to that because it's very interesting, very short selection there. And as you can see here, we have the Great Pyramids of Giza, probably built around 2600, maybe 2400 BC. Then we have three smaller pyramids just in the foreground. There are just, as McClellan and Dorn will tell you, there are many, many pyramids in Egypt. These fellows get the greatest amount of attention. These images are just to give you a little more perspective. You have here some folks enjoying a picnic, enjoying their day at the base of the pyramids. If you read your short selection at Blackboard on pyramid building, you'll understand that each of these blocks is about 2.5 tons each, and that a crew of about 20 men, we believe, could move one of these blocks in about 20 minutes and get it into position. So pyramid building, as compared, we think, with the Stonehenge in England and with the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramid building very fast, very quick. Again, another example of how in a society like Egypt, like other ancient societies that could get organized quickly with leadership, a king, if you will, patronage, we can really get people organized effectively to do this kind of work. This other image is just a view of the temple precinct at Giza here in northern Egypt. And of course, the very famous Sphinx that guards the precinct going into the Great Pyramids. So just another view of that. Well, speaking of leadership, the art of Egypt tends to idealize kings and queens in Egypt. This is an example of a pharaoh, Menkaure is his name, and his wife, Menkaure. Menkaure, as you can see, presented here in this beautiful stone sculpture as sort of perfect in these broad shoulders, narrow waist. He looks very dynamic, moving forward, very muscular. His wife just about a step behind and supporting him with her hands both around his waist and on his arm. Also quite fit, right, as you can see. And so these are young, powerful, vigorous leaders, often depicted as gods in ancient Egypt. In Mesopotamia, our king Gilgamesh is heroic, but he is no god. If you remember the image of Hammurabi, he receives his law codes from the gods, but he himself is not a god. In Egypt, the art tends to reflect that these leaders were godlike, if not actual gods. We have other images of writing coming from Egypt, just as we did in Mesopotamia. And this is a tomb painting where someone has been buried inside this tomb, and we have this writing along the wall. We have this interesting snake figure, which is quite colorful and quite intricate and very complicated. Sorry, we've got a phone ringing. We'll hope that that goes away. But as you can see from the background, you've got this terrific hieroglyphic pictorial writing, just as we saw in Mesopotamian cuneiform. So very early on, very early versions of that. So the other issues that we see here, other beautiful images that we see, we have some amazing tomb painting. Again, this is supposed to be a depiction of a pharaoh, probably a pharaoh in death. We think with this green image here. More examples of the kinds of artwork we see. Again, this is another pharaoh. This is Osiris, who is depicted as a pharaoh. Osiris is the god of the sun, the god of the afterlife. And again, another hallway inside a great tomb where we've been able to preserve some of the paintings, the wall paintings. Mummification, one of the major examples of social life that we see in Egypt, social and religious life, because we think that mummification was offered first only to pharaohs, but as time went on, more and more people got access to mummification, and that meant you got access to the afterlife. So mummification, one of the religious rituals, but it's also a physical ritual, right, that has to be completed in order to make it to the other side. What you have here is an example from the Book of the Dead, the so-called Book of the Dead, which has in the background the hieroglyphs to tell you how to make it to the afterlife. That includes how to be properly mummified and what proper prayers one has to say. And we have the jackal-headed god Anubis, who clearly is human but with a jackal head, who is helping to preserve the body, helping to prepare it for the afterlife. I've always thought it interesting that a jackal, which is essentially an animal that works on carrion, an animal that eats that which is already dead, is helping you to get to the other side, that you would trust such a beastie to help you. And the one thing to consider about mummification is that we think in Egypt, over time, the Egyptians had a very strong understanding of human anatomy, that they had a very clear understanding of the organs of the body. They knew where they were. They may not have known how they functioned, but because of mummification, the Egyptians are actually practicing a kind of dissection of the human body and examining the organs, pulling some of them out and discarding them, as you well know, preserving some of them in the mummification process. When Greek doctors, when Greek scientists come to Egypt, this will be a treasure trove for them, the Book of the Dead, and the descriptions that they'll read of mummifying the body, and also of what is found inside the body when you open it up. One of the other elements of the Book of the Dead, one of the other elements of making it to the afterlife, was this interesting image of weighing the heart. There's our Anubis again, right in the center of this great scale. This great scale. Again, this concept of measuring, weighing, very important to the history of science, very important to the history of technology, but also finding its way into religious ideology. This is you in the afterlife. You're waiting for Judgment Day to happen. This is a plumb. This is what makes sure that the scale is true on both sides. So Anubis is working with that. Over here in a tiny little jar is your heart. In a jar, your heart's been removed and put into this jar in the mummification process. Over here are feathers. Your heart must be as light as a feather in order to make it past Anubis's judgment. And so here we have that. So again, thinking about technology, thinking about religion, there's this idea of trying to weigh the heart. It must be light as a feather, if not lighter, to make it to the other side. And Anubis is helping you in this process. What's interesting to me is that I believe here from this image you can see that Anubis is actually pulling on this side of the scale. and that Anubis is over here sort of adjusting the plumb, the weight to make the scale properly balanced. And I kind of think he's cheating. Right? I kind of think he's cheating over here. So at any rate, this idea of balances and scales, this idea of incorporating that kind of technology into getting to the afterlife is very interesting. We'll end this selection on Egypt with, and all of the phone calls I've been getting, I apologize. We'll end this selection on Egypt with Ramses II. And he is a real king, much like Hammurabi. He comes along in the 1200s BC, about 500 years after Hammurabi, and he's one of the great kings of the ancient world. He's one of the great kings of Egypt. We end with him for a couple of reasons. This is him in his chariot going into war, and it is in the time of Ramses that we come to understand fully that the Egyptians do have the chariot. They do have this kind of wheeled transport. So technologically, they have this. They also have this composite bow, this bow and arrow that Ramses is getting ready to fire away at, that is a very effective in archery and far superior to the kind of bow that existed beforehand. So we're seeing Egypt engaged in weapons technology, in chariot making, that is getting us, if you will, in a time period where society is getting more sophisticated in its use of technology, particularly in warfare. So a nice example here from Ramses II on that. So if you'll get to the next video, we'll try to come up with some conclusions about early civilization, early Neolithic urban revolutions, and how this is contributing to science and technology in the early world.